That was Emma Seppala, lovely woman, and an amazing institute she heads up at Stanford University. And no surprise, the person who got that institute there started was none other than the Dalai Lama. I don't know that there's anybody else that would have that type of influence to start a center of that type at Stanford.
Yeah, I don't know the story, but he obviously pushed some buttons, and the right people came together, and somehow it got funded and all that. I'm sure it's an interesting story that someone can Google
Hmm.
if they wanted to know it. But the fact that science is studying happiness and what makes people happy is well, that's in itself not new. That there's institutes dedicated to that, and the study of altruism and compassion is fairly new. But Abraham Maslow and his colleagues started that whole process back in the 60s when they realized psychology was just studying pathology, and self-actualization uh, theory and humanistic psychology, and those developments came in. So this is just a continuation. I'm sure the methods of uh, research are
Hmm.
much more sophisticated.
Right. What's interesting to me about it, and this is something that to a certain degree you deal with in your book, American Veda, about knowledge of the East coming to the West. Uh, the association of spirituality with happiness, I think, is more from the East, from Hinduism and especially Buddhism, than it is from our Judeo-Christian traditions. Because certainly in Catholicism, which I grew up in that religion, uh, it wasn't about spirituality being associated with happiness. It was the whole idea of the crucifixion and suffering and the stations of the cross and everything, that, uh, ultimately spirituality, salvation, in the next world you'd be happy. But in this world, it wasn't so much about happiness. Whereas I think in Buddhism, especially, the Buddha was more about self realization and inner contentment and peace and overcoming the suffering of the world. So I think
Right.
that, yeah, we take for granted now that we can talk about happiness and spirituality in the same breath and nobody will be shocked. But I don't think that was the case 30 or 40 years ago.
Well, no, and I can tell you from researching American Veda that, for one thing, psychology didn't take religion or spirituality seriously at all. They just, famously, Freud called religion an illusion.
Hmm.
It was foolishness. So it was only the access to Hindu and Buddhist way of looking at the world and the practices, the meditative practices, that gave psychology, a sense that there may be something more
Hmm.
to this whole story. So that those disciplines informed uh, the movement toward humanistic and then transpersonal
Hmm.
psychology, and including spirituality and people's attitudes towards religion, everything in the research repertoire. But I think it was the not just the access to meditation, first meditation, then all the other uh, repertoire of practices that showed that people, by doing what had been called spiritual or religious practices, had a practical effect on helping people become more fulfilled and happy.
Hmm.
But the East also gave intellectual models of higher states of well-being that the West had not even considered.
Right.
Higher states of consciousness, higher
Right.
levels of.
Yeah, I wonder if like Sigmund Freud, who was obviously a very bright guy, and very revolutionary in his thinking, if he had had more exposure to Vedanta, Vedic knowledge, how his theory might have changed. I guess Carl Jung followed him, and he had some of that influence in what he wrote, and he talked about the collective unconscious and whatnot. So I think that yeah, the influence, as you discuss in your book, is found in psychology, but it wasn't there when I was studying it so much.
No, nor I. And if it was, maybe I would have stayed in graduate school.
Yeah,
Uh,
me too. So it was we found the missing link, and it wasn't to be pursued in graduate school. The other thing I thought was interesting was she mentioned Emma mentioned one of the practices one should do every day to gain greater happiness is to write a list of things we're grateful for, gratitude. Now it's come up before, and I think it was Paul Mills, Dr. Paul Mills, who is the head of research for the Chopra Institute. One of the things they found in their research was feelings of specific feelings of gratitude affect longevity, they affect health, they affect all sorts of areas of life, and I find that interesting. And also, I have to think that would be associated with like Norman Vincent Peale and the power of positive thinking. You know that gratitude is an aspect of that. I would think so.
Probably.
And yeah, and hopefully they'll do research on this stuff.
Well, they have. There's a lot of research on gratitude and people who are appreciative rather than critical. And they have done studies on people who, I don't know how rigorous the research is on the use of practices like writing down three things you're
Hmm.
grateful to in the morning or before you go to bed. But certainly there's an awful lot of anecdotal evidence that it changes people's lives and makes inculcates greater happiness. And it wouldn't shock me that there's hard data on that.
Hmm.
In fact, I'm told that there is. And Emma alluded to the fact that there is. And it makes sense. I mean, think of, if you're in the habit of just finding fault everywhere and everything not being good enough and problems taking the forefront of your thinking, that the biochemistry of that can't be as good as being grateful for what you
Hmm.
have and what's there. And finding all the little things we have to be grateful
Right,
for.
right,
It makes perfect sense.
right.
As
And I
long as you're not Pollyannish
right.
about it. I mean, you can. It's easy enough to see people saying, and we hear it all the time. If I hear one more person say it's all good, I think I'll, because it's not. But if you can be grateful and at the same time realistic,
Yeah,
and
yeah, I agree. I mean, a certain amount of happiness is a choice, a certain amount isn't. But if you have to culture the attitude to see the rose and not the thorns, and doesn't mean you're gonna be happy all the time, but it is something you have to work on. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, Phil, you may know more about this. Well, she talked a couple of times about Kriya breathing. I assume that's the teaching that Sri Ravi Shankar, his techniques, which I think involve meditation and this Kriya breathing. And I have
yeah,
talked to a
she
number
was.
of people who practice it who have felt they've
Yeah.
derived a lot of benefit from it.
Yeah, she was. She mentioned Sudarshan Kriya. That's the technique that
Hmm.
Sri Ravi Shankar created and introduced as a sort of centerpiece of his Art of Living programs. And she's a practitioner, obviously. Yeah,
Yeah.
and they have other practices in their meditation practices, very much like TM and similar mantra-based practices.
Yeah, her Center for Compassion and Altruism for the research and education in that area. I wonder, is it have you been there? Is it an actual building
No,
on campus? Is it
I
just one
don't
or two
know. It's
people?
a good question.
I'll volunteer to follow up on that. I'd like to find out more. And this whole area of happiness and the neurophysiology of happiness, and how one can culture and develop that in its relationship to spiritual development. And also, you touched upon this when you talked to her about spiritual experience and how
Yeah.
that specifically relates to happiness. So, um,
I mean, basically, we're talking about uh, positive transformation in people's lives.
mhm,
Whether you call it happiness or well-being or fulfillment or anything else, and it comes back to, one of the things she said was, the traditional religious teachings of being kind and compassionate and
Right.
serving others and all that. There's reason for it. We've come to think of those things as religious injunctions, and tickets to a good afterlife or something, and most people reject that. But
Hmm.
when you see scientific data
Right.
that people are simply more happy and have better relationships and better family lives, it removes the onus of that kind of religiosity
Right.
and
And
piety.
she also mentioned about a lot of young people being just filled with adrenaline all the time because they're in a constant state of fight or flight, which at one point
Yeah,
in their evolution of thousands of years ago might have been more appropriate. Now it's not, and the inability to turn off that fight or flight response, I think, leads to a lot of illness later in life, especially heart disease,
yeah.
stroke,
I mean,
that sort of
I
thing.
don't think being a kid or an adolescent was ever easy.
Hmm.
But when we were that age, we had a lot of free time.
Hmm.
We could just mess around. I mean, I
Right.
was out in the streets of Brooklyn after school for almost every day
Yeah, I mean,
playing
when I
in
was
the,
a kid, I grew up in New Jersey, a few miles from New York City. I was on a block, you were on your block, and you went out to play, and then you had to figure out things to do, whether it was stickball or whatever it
right.
was. You would do it. Whereas now, everything is much more structured, at least for a lot of kids, and or the kids are just in a room staring at a video screen, playing some type of game
Yeah.
that's addictive. So, uh,
And the pressure to start thinking about grades and colleges when you're like in fifth or sixth grade. I mean, I didn't even think about that till
right,
halfway through
right.
high school.
Yeah, no,
And
I think it's extremely unhealthy, and I want to share this with our audience. I mean, I just talked to somebody whose son lives in New York, and they have a kid, he's 3 years old, and they're already taking him to interviews so he can get into this private school, and they're fearful he won't make the cut. Now, I've heard, people used to worry about getting into a college, but getting into
right,
to
right.
this is not good. This is not healthy. Don't
No.
support
Can you
that.
imagine the pressure the kids
No,
feel?
horrible, horrible, and it can't. And the parents, and it's crazy. Anyway, hopefully those tuning in and listening to our guests speaking about various aspects of spirituality will gain a healthy perspective and a happy attitude, and won't put themselves under unnecessary pressure, and
Yeah.
take time to enjoy life.
And we should, down the road, have Emma back on and find out what the latest findings are.
Absolutely. I think it'd be a great one to follow up on. All right, Phil. Till next time.
Okay. Next time, Dennis.